Our scripture lesson this morning is from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. Then God spoke these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. It was 9 years ago this week that my father died. 9 years ago, and there are still conversations that I would like to have, questions that I would like to ask. Do you think that odd, that I would be thinking that 9 years later? Maybe it's because I'm also thinking about retirement in a few months, and this is the only church that he did not ever see me serve, and you are the only congregation that he did not get to know him, at least a little bit. And that makes me somewhat sad. About 3 months before he died, we celebrated his 85th birthday with a dinner at the top of the Space Needle in Seattle. And though we lived in Seattle when the thing was built in the early 60s, and he drove by it on his way to work every day for a couple of years, he never lived very far from there either, but he had never been up to the top of the Space Needle. He had a bit of a fear of heights, and so it was a goal for his children, if not his own, a goal to get him up there. And he stood at the back and looked at the floor of the elevator all the way up, but everything went well, and it was nice, really nice. A couple of months later, we attended a funeral together. During the funeral, the son of the deceased talked about some unhappy memories of his father, which got my father to thinking, I guess, so that on the drive home, he was sort of apologizing and sort of asking what my sister and I thought of his parenting. We tried to convince him that he had nothing to apologize for. Whether or not he believed us, I cannot say for sure. It was the last time I saw him. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was driving on I-90 somewhere between Moses Lake and Ritzville, going to see our daughter in Cheney. The phone rang. Caller ID said it was from an unknown number in the 206 area code, so I ignored it. A couple minutes later, the phone rang again, and I took the next exit and checked my voicemail. It was my sister-in-law. My father had been out walking. He was hit by a car. We didn't know the extent of his injuries, but he was taken to Harborview Hospital. At first, we thought the most serious injury was to his leg. They might have to do surgery. And then they discovered bleeding on his brain, and 12 hours after the accident, he died. Today I want to talk about one of the commandments, not all 613 that are in the Hebrew Bible, not even the 10 or 11 that I just read in Exodus, just one. The one that says, honor your father and mother, which is something more than doing what they tell you to do when you're a kid, though that may be part of it. And it is more than listening to them tell the same story again and again when they're old, though that may be part of it too. Honoring your father and mother is something you can do when they're here, but it's also something you can do when they're gone, even 9 or 39 years gone, by the way you remember them, the lessons that you learned, and the way you live your life. Perhaps that's why the rabbis used to say that honor your father and mother is the hardest of all the commandments to keep. And actually, truth be told, today I don't want to talk about the commandment to honor your father and mother. I want to do it, at least as it concerns my father. I'll have to save my mother for another day. So if you will indulge me, let me tell you something about him and some of the things I learned from him. I think it is fair to say that my father was something of a creature of habit, good habits mostly, I'd like to think. That's why he was a Methodist, I'm sure, and why we have a book of discipline rather than a book of order. My father had discipline. Anyway, one of my father's rituals for many years was to write a letter once a month to everyone in the family. He wrote about things that he had done and places that he had been and what was happening with the shrubbery in the yard, or as in his last letter, the plants on the deck outside his apartment, stuff like that. And he usually had a couple of quotes from things that he had read recently. Did you know that California scientists listed 508 varieties of dirt as endangered? I bet you didn't even know there were 508 varieties of dirt, let alone 508 that were endangered. Or that medieval people believed that Adam was expelled from paradise on the same day of the year that the Annunciation, when the angel came to Mary and said she was going to have a baby. And it was also supposedly the same day that Jesus was crucified. Do you know what president said, architecture is my delight and putting up and pulling down one of my favorite amusements? That would be Thomas Jefferson. Did you know that there's a National Mustard Museum in Middleton, Wisconsin with 5,300 mustards from 50 states and 60 countries? Well, at least there used to be. 9 years ago, they needed to raise $200,000 to pay off a loan, and I don't know if they ever did that. When I was in high school, we were in the gymnasium for an assembly, and one of the girls in my class leaned over and asked me, "Is your father normal?" And I don't know what provoked her to ask such a question, and during a school assembly. Maybe it was something she'd been wondering for a while. Yeah, it was something about being a minister, I guess, because ministers are notoriously not normal. But I remember not knowing what it meant. He was the only father I ever had. I'm still not sure what it means. What is normal? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Did you ever hear the story about Leo the Lop? Leo was a rabbit. Unlike other rabbits, though, his ears hung down instead of going up. He tried and tried and tried to get them to stand up, but they wouldn't. And in the end, Leo learns that normal is whatever you are, whether your ears hang down or they stand up. And I like that story. And I think my dad tried to treat people the same way, too, no matter the color of their skin or what way their ears went. Among the friends of God, there are all kinds of people, with different strengths, different weaknesses and interests and experiences. And God is able to use each one according to their gifts for some special purpose. It's very evident among the prophets. There are hellfire and brimstone ones and comfort and consolation ones. There are gloom and doom ones, and there are hope and renewal ones. And not all the prophets would do well in all times and situations. Jesus could weep for those who did not know the things that make for peace and talk about feeling like a a mother hen gathering her chicks under her wing. But then there was that time that he got so angry that he started knocking over some tables and shaking things up in the temple. And that story shocks us because it seems so out of character for him. He who always seemed to have time for the children and people who were lost and hurting and afraid. Well, Dad was not stern or strict. Fussy, yes, but not a fearsome figure. He did not have a mean bone in his body. He never struck me, but he was not one to play with the kids either. And I'm not sure I could say that we were close when I was growing up. It would be to Mom that I would go for comfort or conversation. If not normal, he was typical, I think, of many fathers of his generation. Dad worked. Mom stayed home, raised the kids until I was in junior high, and we had this family meeting to see if it would be okay with the kids if Mom got a part-time job. Now, how many parents ask for the thoughts and opinions of their children even today on such things? That impressed me. But when Mom went to work, she still fixed supper and washed the clothes and cleaned the house. Faithfulness is what I appreciate most about my father. 40 years he served churches, teaching and preaching and visiting the sick and listening to troubles and complaints and not always getting recognition or appreciation for what he did. Years later, the local newspaper editor, who was a member of the church and family friend where we once lived, told me how the church and the town might have split apart during a bitter strike at the paper mill that employed half the people in town, if not for what my father had done, though it was mostly behind the scenes, and I never knew that. Another time, I met a man at a funeral who was himself a minister, and he said my father had a lot to do with that too. Faithfulness. 57 years my father was married to my mother. While there were disagreements, I never saw them argue. I never heard them yell. In their relationship, there was respect, there was trust, there was love, though it wasn't expressed in lots of hugs and kisses, but in simple acts of kindness and courtesy. As my mother got more confused and got less able to get around, my father became a caregiver, as his father had done for his two wives who both developed Alzheimer's disease. For my father and his father, it wasn't a matter of wanting to or not wanting to. It wasn't a matter of being fair or right. It's what had to be done. It's what you do. He took a vow, for better or for worse. He made a promise, and he kept it. So he learned to fix supper and do the laundry and clean the house, sort of. Bless you also, who have been likewise faithful, caring for spouses, perhaps, or parents, or children, even if you didn't know that's what you were signing up for years ago. Second thing I appreciate about my father was his constancy. He was steady, not one to get too high or too low, too up or too down. A lot of people over the ages have observed that right after great success, there is often great disappointment. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because we get to thinking that things will always go well, and when they don't, we're not ready for it. And well, the children of Israel, you may remember, were free. Pharaoh's army was destroyed, and it was a miracle, and they sang and they danced, but then only a few days later, they were grumbling and griping and wishing they were back in Egypt. So too with Elijah, right after his greatest triumph, when he and God defeated the priests of Baal, we see Elijah running for his life. Elijah is full of self-pity. Woe is me, he says. I'm the only one. He'd rather be dead. What happened to that courage that he showed just a few days before when confronting God's enemies? Where was the faith with which he soaked the wood that was going to burn the sacrifice? There was disappointment in Dad's life. He really wouldn't be normal if there wasn't. He did get discouraged, especially when his cataract surgery went all wrong, but he still kept believing and hoping and learning and loving. The grip of discouragement or despair or depression can be awful strong sometimes. If you've ever been there, you know it's all too easy for others to say, don't worry, be happy, or to give advice that's not at all helpful. There was a man named Arsenius who once said, I have often repented of having spoken, but never of having remained silent. Dad had that underlined in one of his books. Dad was a listener. He was never much of an athlete, at least not the competitive sort, but he always ate a banana with his shredded wheat or Rice Krispies and orange juice for breakfast. And he went to bed early and got up early, and he always exercised daily, doing sit-ups and stretching and walking and riding his bicycle. Are you not feeling well? A little grumpy, burned out perhaps? The Bible tells us that our bodies are the temple of God. Take care of them. Wholeness and wellness always include adequate sleep, a balanced diet, some kind of regular exercises, as well as taking time to exercise the heart and mind and soul by praying and reading and learning. Dad did that in spades, and John Wesley would have approved. Where do you find the time to be alone for silence, reflection, meditation, prayer? It's important to do, though how you do it may not work for everyone. Not everyone can pray 4 hours a day before breakfast like John Wesley. Some of us find it difficult to pray for 4 minutes at a time. Maybe you could read the upper room devotional before breakfast. Many of you do. I know Dad did that. He also used to take a week once in a while and go stay at a monastery. Others make a space inside themselves where they can retreat to reflect while walking or woodworking or journaling or gardening, even while commuting to work. It provides a chance to reflect on the events of the day and upon one's relationship with God. However you do it, make sure you do it. That's a lot of what the Sabbath is about and how you keep it holy. Even Jesus needed time to get away from the crowds to think and to pray, don't you know? That's what he was doing when he went to the country of the Gerasenes, where he met this man whose name we do not know. We only know him as Legion, a nickname that he had given himself because there were so many demons in him. He had no clothes. He didn't live at home. He was unable to live among the living, so he lived among the dead in a cemetery. All his friends and neighbors put chains on him, but he wouldn't be restrained. He was unable to keep from hurting himself. The people at home were afraid that he might hurt them. And perhaps in his better moments, he understood that fear. He was afraid too. But how terribly lonely he must have been. Jesus shows no fear, though, as he approaches this man. Jesus must have seen beyond his behavior, beyond his appearance, into a place inside the man's heart and soul that cried out to be made well and to be restored to life. When I think of that story, I think of my father who would visit a young man named Scott regularly. Scott was in prison for murder. His family was part of the church, though they were not active. I think of my father's volunteer work with AIDS patients at Swedish Hospital in Seattle, back when AIDS was a pretty fatal diagnosis. I think of a homeless family who lived in the family's garage for a time when my father was growing up as a boy. I think of the man who was driving the car that hit and killed my father. He was a Green Beret medic in Vietnam. He was a retired firefighter. He saved lives. He tried to save my dad. He was a victim in the whole thing too, you see. It was an accident. He was a man of faith. And I pray that he is not remembering that day 9 years ago still with guilt and grief. May he have peace in his heart and mind and soul. Somehow this man came into our lives and is part of our circle of concern where before he was not. Just as Adam was not whole until there was another one like him, another one to share the wonder and share the pain, we are made to live in community. In the Western world, we have defined what it is to be human by our ability to think. It was a man named Descartes who said, "I think, therefore I am," but In Africa, they say, I belong, therefore I am. People who belong nowhere to no one, they would say in Africa, are not fully human. Now, sometimes certain people must live apart from the community, like that man named Legion, at least for a time, in prisons or in hospitals. But thank God for those who are able to see beyond behavior and appearance, to see us as Jesus sees us, to see that for which we have been made, in whose image we have been made, so that no one should ever feel alone, and that all may know that they belong to God, always, no matter what. On Dad's 70th birthday, he made a list of 70 things he wanted to do before he died, and he had been able to check off many of them. He traveled to many places, often in an elder hostel program where you don't just see a place, but you learn about it while you're there. And Dad was planning trips to Cuba and Canada for later that year when he died. It is good to have goals and ambitions, to always be learning and growing and trying new things. Dad taught me that. He didn't want to die when he did. We didn't want him to die either, but he also never wanted to get old, if that means having nothing to do or being able to do nothing. In life, there will be disappointment. There will be failure. We may not be able to do anything about it, but we can do something about what we do next. As they say, focus on the size of our God, not on the size of our problem. At times, we may feel unworthy and inadequate, but don't brood on it. Admit it and listen for God's next assignment. Don't look up and don't look down, look up. Don't look back, look forward, always. There will be endings in life, but not in death, for in God there is no end. Amen.